beginning 18. We've got through 17. So we are making progress. Let's see what we remember. We'll just do it together. You just kind of interactive here. Chapter 1, the ascension of Jesus and? Good. 2? Chapter. All right, Pentecost, establishment of the church. 3? All right, Peter and John. Did somebody say Peter and James? I thought I heard that. Peter and John heal the lame man, then they preach on Solomon's porch. Then Peter and John are arrested, brought before the Sanhedrin, and charged not to teach or preach. And at the end of the chapter, we have the unity and benevolence of the early church. 5, Ananias and Sapphira, lie, die, imprisonment of all the apostles, and they're saved by who? By Gamaliel. But also, they're not just charged not to teach. What happens at the end of 5? They're beaten. All right. Then 6, did that slow down the growth? No. Multitudes were added. The church was multiplying to the degree that there was a negligence. What was it? That's right. Grecian widows were being neglected. So they chose 7, 2 of whom, Philip and Stephen, are significant to the story, the narrative. And so at the end of 6, which one of those 2 fellows begins to dispute with the synagogue of the Libertines? Stephen, right. And then they bring him before the council in 7. He starts with the call of Abraham and ends with the death of Jesus. And then they don't like what he said, so they do what to him? They stone him. And then on that day, 8 verse 1, there arose a great persecution against the church. They were scattered except for the little group of the apostles. All right, Philip goes down to Samaria. And so we have the conversion of the Samaritans. Then the second conversion in Acts 8 is the conversion of the Ethiopian. 9, the conversion of Saul and Peter's work, where he leaves Jerusalem and goes to Lydda, heals Aeneas. Joppa raises Dorcas. All right, 10, conversion of Cornelius. 11, Peter's, what's that, Janice? Explanation. Good. And then we have some about the church there in Antioch. All right. Who is the fellow who comes up and says there's going to be a dearth, or not a dearth? You've got the right answer. You know the question for me. A dearth. That's right. A dearth. Yeah, I think it. The other phrase is famine, I think, but I couldn't get that. Okay, so that's in 11. Then 12, the death of James, the brother of John, imprisonment of Peter, and then the death of Herod Agrippa, number 1. All right, then 13 and 14, we have the first journey, primarily in the area of southern Galatia. Good. 15, we have the council in Jerusalem over whether or not Gentiles have to be circumcised and keep the law of Moses. In 1536, we have the beginning of journey number 2. Paul wanted to revisit the churches, and so there was that disturbance between him and Barnabas over John Mark. And so Paul takes Silas and goes through Syria, Cilicia, and Barnabas takes John Mark and sails to the Isle of Cyprus. Good. All right, so let's, then chapter into 15 and then on into 16. We go from through Syria, the region of Syria, and might as well, no, I'm not going to do that yet. Through Syria and Cilicia, and then we come to Lystra and find Timothy. Circumcised him, brings on, he was well reported out by the brethren in Lystra and Derbe. Moves on to Troas and picks up Luke. Good. At Troas, Paul has this vision, and he sees a man of Macedonia saying, come over and help us. So they set a straight course through Samothracia, and then came eventually to Philippi. We have the conversion first of Lydia, and then the jailer. All right? He leaves, I'll let it slip. Whom did he leave at Philippi? Luke. All right, so he's got Silas and Timothy. And then Timothy evidently stays a little while back at Philippi. And so Paul and Silas go to Thessalonica. For 3 Sabbath days he reasons in the synagogue, opening and alleging or explaining and telling these people that it behooved the Christ to suffer and rise again from the dead the third day. And there were pretty good responses, women, men, but the Jews didn't like it. So they stirred up the lewd men of the King James say, the lewd men of the baser sort, yes, and assaulted the house of Jason. All right, so Paul is able to escape, and he leaves Thessalonica and goes to Berea. All right, he's there, and they are more noble than those in Thessalonica because they received the word with readiness of mind, searching the scriptures daily whether those things were so. Well, then he leaves Thessalonica and goes to Athens. And then he's in the agora, the marketplace, and he preaches for a while. Then he encounters these Stoic and Epicurean philosophers. So they want to bring him up to the Areopagus, or the Hill of Mars. And so they do that, and then Paul gives his speech. At the end of it, when he mentioned the resurrection, some mocked at that. But there were a few. A couple are named. A woman by the name of Damaris. And what's the other person's name? Yes, yeah, or Dionysius, I think it is. You're right, and maybe a few others. All right, so one thing, and this is in your notes, one thing that's significant about leaving Athens versus leaving Berea and leaving Thessalonica is he didn't encounter what? Opposition, no persecution. And likely it was because people were just what?
Well, they wanted to hear something new, and they weren't threatened.
They really weren't convicted that much. Everywhere Paul has been so far, when you had a pretty good Jewish population, and they did not want to see the truth, there was hot opposition, hostility was rampant against Paul. But at Athens, it's like, let's just live and let live, and you have your right to your belief, and I'll have my right to mine, and we'll just all be happy, and not really. And that, to me, is where we are in the United States. You have very few people who believe anything about anything.
And there wasn't synagogues, so
that's
there
right.
probably
weren't that many Jews. Exactly. High Greek population. Good point, Jan. All right, so let's do this. Charlie, let's go ahead and start with this chart number 30. Here's our second journey, just to visualize it. Leaving Antioch, going through the region of Syria. Syria extends on up here. And then Cilicia. And then we have Lystra picking up Timothy. And then we go on, wanted to go up into Bithynia and Asia. The Spirit forbade them, so they go on to Troas. Luke is picked up, so we have Silas to start with, Timothy, and Luke with Paul. And then the straight course through Samothracia, Neapolis, and then the conversions of Lydia and the jailer, then Amphipolis, Apollonia, Thessalonica, and then in 17, then Berea, and then Athens. Now in chapter 18, we come over to Corinth. We've already gone through this. I'm just going to, he leaves Athens, and then we talked about, let's see, we talked about this. We showed pictures. Charlie, we'll just kind of fast forward through this. These are the pictures that we showed of Athens, but I wanted to continue on till we got to Corinth. All right, now we're on to Corinth, and when we come to Corinth, in the first 4 verses of Acts 18, Paul encounters a couple that will be near and dear to him the rest of his life. Who are they? That's exactly right. And we don't know if they were already converted. They just mentions they were Jews who had been expelled from Rome due to the edict of Claudius. And so they are there, and Paul, lives with them because they were of the same, trade, occupation. They were tent makers, which we understand from extra biblical sources was a fairly lucrative business. So they're together. Perhaps they were all in a rented house. I don't know. But whatever the case is, they're together. And though it doesn't state that they weren't Christians or disciples, it doesn't state that they are, it's obvious that they became such in very short time. Okay, so here's a picture, an aerial. The ancient city of Corinth was one of the major commercial centers of the ancient world. Its glory spanned both the Greek and Roman empires, first as a member of the Achaean League, and later the capital city of the Roman province of Achaia. Achaia is Greek for Greek, or Greece rather. It was perfectly situated at the narrowest part of the isthmus, a level piece of limestone 4 miles wide connecting mainland Greece with the southern peninsula, the Peloponnesus. Corinth had a port on either side of the isthmus, Lakon on the Corinth Gulf, and Cenchrea on the Saronic Gulf, and thus held control of the seas on both sides of Greece. Now we are reminded in Romans 16, there's a lady who must have been a wonderful woman, starts with PH. Name was Phoebe, yeah. Phoebe was a disciple at Cenchrea. So that's the port on the opposite side. So here we have this, basically the canal was eventually dug, but you have the Aegean over here, the Adriatic, and a very small area. Here's a canal. In the 6th century BC, Periander first conceived of the idea to dig a canal through the isthmus to connect the Corinth and Saronic Gulfs. The project failed, as did later attempts by Greek and Roman rulers, but a road called the Diopus was constructed around that time. Nero actually started operations on the canal in 66, 67 AD, which would be a little bit after the time that we're talking about 10 years. He made the first strike at the land using his golden pick. Work was conducted by Jewish prisoners, but was interrupted by an insurrection in Gaul. The project was abandoned when Nero died. From 1882 to 1893, 11 years, French school investigated these beginnings of a canal and cut their own canal across the isthmus along Nero's route. This canal is too narrow for most of today's cargo or cruise ships. 2 bridges were built across the canal for railway and national road. On April 26, 1941, German parachutists captured these bridges and cut communication with British forces. Both bridges have been rebuilt since that time. So this is that canal that goes from the Saronic Gulf to the Gulf of Corinth. Now here is a picture of some of the ruins of ancient Corinth with the agora, or think agora, or when you read the word marketplace, think marketplace, think strip mall, a place where people come and you've got shops and people are selling their wares. That's in the foreground here. And the Acropolis, the mount on which temples to the gods would be built, is in the background up here. The Bema, or judgment seat that we'll get to in just a little bit in Acts 18, where Galileo was, and they brought them before here, and he dismissed the charges. It provided a platform or a stage where eloquent speeches were made and where civil cases could be heard. So it was kind of like a community center with a type of stage where people could test out their oratory. And, if you could make people laugh or make them cry or whatever, then you were considered an orator. And so that's what was there. And that's what Paul entered. It's so fascinating to me. When you think about what the Corinthians actually extolled, human wisdom, eloquence, And Paul said in chapter 2 of 1 Corinthians, when I came to you, I came not with excellency of speech or of wisdom, proclaiming unto you the testimony of God. For I determined not to know anything among you save Jesus Christ and him crucified. If anybody could have wowed people with his eloquence, it would have been Paul. But he chose to use simple language in terms that Christ was glorified, the cross of Christ. Here's another, the Bema, oratory, worldly wisdom, the marketplace, the agora, where obviously dishonest business dealings would have occurred, and Paul dealt with that later on in 1 Corinthians 6. And the Acropolis, on which immorality in the pagan temples would have been practiced, all kinds of sexual immorality. And then to the god of Bacchus, the god of drinking. There would have been drunkenness and revelry, all that was mixed in. So you've got drinking and sexual practices and worship to false gods. You've got all of that in this pagan city. The Lycaon road ran from the city to its northern part. The road had a drainage system and was used for a number of centuries. It was the northern ancient port of Corinth, situated on the Corinth Gulf. The reason I'm going into a little detail about this that I find fascinating is because it shows the great commerce, that was a part of the Corinthian life. And usually with great commerce goes wealth, and with wealth you've got a lot of other problems that come. It connected Corinth with the Western world, especially Italy. In the 5th century, Lycaon housed the Corinthian fleet and was later used by the Macedonians and the Romans for military purposes. Because of its importance, the port grew into a city of its own, housing various temples and remaining occupied for many centuries. The city of Corinth was connected to its port via the Lycaon road. So Paul likely traveled these roads. Near the agora, an inscription was found that mentions a man named Erastus, who laid the pavement as his own expense. And the inscription almost certainly would refer to the Erastus, whom Paul described as a treasurer of the city when he wrote the Roman letter from Corinth. Okay, so here we go. In this map, I've animated a little. We go on to Ephesus, and then over to Philippi, to Thessalonica. Religion, they had idolatry, but they also had Jews there. Immorality was rampant. Idleness was common, as we see in 2 Thessalonians. And among many of them, death ended it all. And Paul reminded them throughout the end of every chapter in 1 Thessalonians that Jesus Christ is coming again. And then the resurrection of all people will be a part of it. And we talked about how Paul had preached the gospel there in Thessalonica. The mob attacked Jason's residence. Peace bond was taken, and Paul goes to Berea and then Athens. He asked Silas and Timothy to join him in Athens. And then Paul said, here's what we'll find today. Hopefully we'll get to here. I think we can. While Paul is in Athens, back in chapter 17, he is very concerned about the Thessalonians. At some point, Timothy joins Paul in Athens. We don't read this in Acts, but we do in 1 Thessalonians. Timothy joins Paul down in the city of Athens. And Paul is so worried that he says, I just thought it best to be left alone, and I sent Timothy to you. So Timothy goes back to Thessalonica. Paul is by himself at Athens. As he is in Thessalonica and Silas in Berea, at some point Paul moves over to Corinth, in the point that we're studying right now. During the meantime, both Silas and Timothy come from Macedonia, evidently Timothy from Thessalonica and Silas from Berea. They come to Paul in Corinth, and they bring at least two things. They bring funds from the churches of Macedonia, that would have been Philippi, Thessalonica, and Berea, to help Paul in his, supporting him in his preaching. We'll get into that in a little bit. And they also bring a good report of the Thessalonians. They're doing well. They're being persecuted, Paul, but they're holding in very well. Paul is so thankful that he writes the letter. Timothy brings a good report. So this is the first letter really we've come to here in Acts 18. At the time at which time Paul will write the letter. So he writes 1 Thessalonians with Silas and Timothy down here in Corinth, back to Thessalonica. And I'm just going with this. It's we'll have the first letter written from Corinth. The theme seems to be holiness in view of the second coming of Christ. The time is approximately 51 to 52. We have some key verses in chapter 3. It's a prayer for their steadfastness, their continued faith. Key words, sanctification, the coming of the Lord. In two-part outline. In 1 through 3, it is primarily historical. He commends their faith in spite of the persecution they had undergone, and then he describes his work among them and how he, evidently Paul has some detractors there. And then 4 and 5 deal with more practical lessons, how they ought to live holy lives in the light of Jesus' return. All right, let's stop there, and let's get into our reading and see how far we can go. Anybody have a question or comment you want to make on? I know I did a lot of talking there. Anybody? Anything? Yes, ma'am.
When you said tent maker, I always thought of tents, nomads and living in tents. But I also was told that, no, that's talking about a prayer shawl. Which is it, or is it both?
No, I think it would be the making of tent structures and dealing with the animal hides that were. I don't think it's a prayer shawl. I think that would have been cut. That would have been a different word would have been used altogether on that. Where'd you hear that? Just out of curiosity.
Someone told me that because I had believed what you
Yeah.
believed.
Yeah.
And they said that I was wrong.
No, I don't think so. The word itself would indicate just the leather, the leather cutting and sewing that would be sufficient to make various tents places. All right, let's read here. Robin, if you would, the first 4 verses.
After these things, he left Athens and went to Corinth. And he found a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, having recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to leave Rome, and he came to them. And because he was of the same trade, he stayed with them, and they were working by trade, they were tent makers. And he was reasoning in the synagogue every Sabbath and trying to persuade Jews and Greeks.
All right, so he meets this couple, and we only know them as Jews who had come from Rome, but actually natives of, or at least he was a native of Pontus, right? And so they're tent makers. They're in the city of Corinth, and so because they're of the same trade, they live together. During this time, for a while, Paul reasons in the synagogue every Sabbath day, and it was moderately successful. He persuaded Jews and Greeks. But I want you to notice, let's keep reading, 5 through 11. There's a transition that occurs in verse 5, and you know that because of the word what? But. Martha, why don't you read for us verses 5 through 11, please?
When Silas and Timothy had come from Macedonia, Paul was compelled by the Spirit and testified to the Jews that Jesus is the Christ. But when they opposed him and blasphemed, he shook his garment and said to them, "Your blood is upon your heads. I am clean. From now on I will go to the Gentiles." And he departed from there and entered the house of a certain man named Justus, for one who worshiped God, whose house was next door to the synagogue. Then Cyprus,
The Crispus?
the ruler of the synagogue, believed on the Lord with all his household, and many of the Corinthians, hearing, believed and were baptized. Now the Lord spoke to Paul in the night by a vision, do not be afraid, but speak, and do not keep silent, for I am with you, and no one will attack you to hurt you. For I have many people in this city. And he continued there a year and 6 months, teaching the word of God among them.
All right, thank you, Martha. Let's keep reading. Ross, read 12 through 17. Now, let's keep in mind what we've studied so far. He comes to Corinth and finds the couple, Aquila and Priscilla. He lives with them for a while. He's reasoning in the synagogue on a daily basis. Silas and Timothy come from Macedonia. And we've already established from other passages that they bring a good report to Paul of the Thessalonians and also bring support. That likely is indicated in this phrase, he was constrained by the word. The New American Standard has that. Robin, do you have the New American Standard? Read verse 5 one more time.
But when Silas and Timothy came down from Macedonia, Paul began devoting himself completely to the word.
Yes, that's what I was looking for. The New American Standard makes it abundantly clear. He was devoting himself to the word. Why could he devote himself to the word now and not have to continue with his making of tents? He was being supported by the money that had come down, the resources that Silas and Timothy had brought from Macedonia. And so as a result of that, there's an intensive effort made, and the Jews began not liking that. And so they opposed and blasphemed Paul, and so there is a separation made. They no longer are meeting there around the synagogue, but they separate themselves and begin to meet in a fellow's house by the name of Titus Justus. And and he happened to live next door to the synagogue. So you've got a lot of interaction with the synagogue. Well, it just so happens that the ruler, whose name was Crispus, the ruler of the synagogue, believes in the Lord with all of his house. And many of the Corinthians, hearing, believed and were baptized. However, Paul is still afraid of what's going to happen. So the Lord appears to him and says, Paul, don't you worry. Don't be afraid, but speak and hold not your peace. You just keep on and be emboldened, because I'm with you, and I have much people in this city. That's spoken of prospectively, obviously. And so how long is Paul there? A year and 6 months. We don't know if that's total time or if that's total down to the time of verse 12. Let's keep reading here. Ross, 12 through 17, please.
And when Gallio was the deputy of Achaia, the Jews made insurrection with one accord against Paul and brought him to the judgment seat, saying, This fellow persuadeth men to worship God contrary to the law. And when Paul was now about to open his mouth, Gallio said to the Jews, If it were a matter of wrong or wicked lewdness, O you Jews, reason would that I should bear with you. But if it be a question of words and names, and of your law, look ye to it. For I will be no judge of such matters. And he drave them from the judgment seat. Then all the Greeks took Sosthenes, the chief ruler of the synagogue, and beat him before the judgment seat. And Gallio cared for none of those things.
Yeah, he didn't interfere. He just kind of let them have at Sosthenes. Evidently, there had been a change in leadership of the synagogue, from Crispus, the ruler of the synagogue, to Sosthenes. However, it is a fascinating point to me that when you read the opening statements in the First Corinthian letter, Sosthenes is mentioned as as a Christian, faithful Christian. And you would like to think that not only did Crispus obey the gospel, but Sosthenes as well here at the city of Corinth. I think that's an interesting idea. All right, let's stop for a minute and answer some of our questions. We really, with that reading, we find Luke's record of what went on there in Corinth. And of course, the epistles give us a whole lot more information. All right, on page 33 of our booklets, I mentioned in the note this chapter concludes Paul's second journey. Note the time Paul spent at Corinth. We already have in verse 18. I did not mention this. Paul having tarried after this yet many days. So it's likely that you have the year and a half, the incident with Gallio, and then many more days, and then he leaves. Likely the better part of 2 years, I'm guessing. The city was very wicked. Its influence among the church members is seen in the 2 letters Paul wrote to the church. Nevertheless, the power of the gospel produced great results. We see that in 1 Corinthians 6. We may appreciate more what Paul said about idolatry and immorality in the Corinthian letters if we know something about its circumstances. Some of this I've already gone through on the charts. For a century, Corinth was the largest and most prosperous city of mainland Greece. Destroyed in 146 BC, was desolate until Julius Caesar rebuilt it in 44 BC. Strategically, it was located in the Roman province of Achaia on a narrow strip of land between the Aegean and Adriatic seas, center for trade and so on. If you'll drop down a sentence or two, to live like a Corinthian meant to live in gross immorality, and this was encouraged by temple prostitution in the many pagan temples of the city. Though the restored city of Paul's day was a Roman city, inhabitants continued to worship Greek gods. West of the Lakion Road, north of the Agora, stood the old temple of Apollo, probably partially destroyed by Mummius in 146. 7 of the original 38 columns still stand. There were shrines to Hermes, Heracles, Athena, and Poseidon. Next paragraph. Corinth had a famous temple dedicated to Asclepius, the god of healing, and his daughter Hygeia. You can see where hygienic comes. Several buildings were constructed around the temple for the sick who came for healing. Patients left at the temple terracotta replicas of the parts of their bodies that had been healed. Some of these replicas have been found in the ruins. I have some pictures of that, but not on these slides. Most significant pagan cult was the cult of Aphrodite. The worship of Aphrodite had flourished in Old Corinth before its destruction in 146 and was revived in Roman Corinth. A temple for the worship of Aphrodite was located on the top of the Acropolis. Strabo, a historian, wrote concerning this, the temple of Aphrodite was so rich that it owned more than 1,000 temple slaves, courtesans, whom both men and women had dedicated to the goddess. And therefore, it was also on account of these women that the city was crowded with people and grew rich. For instance, the chief captains freely squandered their money, and hence the proverb, not for every man is a voyage to Corinth. Jewish worship also was a part of the religious life of the city, as we see Paul beginning his work in the synagogue. He entered with what would seem less promise than one would have thought concerning Athens, but ultimately there were far more fruitful results. From Corinth, Paul also wrote the 2 letters to the Thessalonians, thus beginning the letter writing. All right, let's answer some of our questions here. Overall, you can see from all that history that it was in a tremendously wicked city, and yet the gospel penetrated the hearts of people to the degree that many of the Corinthians hearing believed and were baptized, and yet there were all kinds of problems. And this is a lesson for us, I think, that here's the world. And here's the church, and we ought to be living holy lives that are above the conduct, the behavior of the world. But the truth of the matter is, the world around us influences us. And when you think about what we've read, what is one of the big problems of Corinth? False doctrine or sexual sins? It'd be the sexual sins. And given the history and the pagan temples and all that went on in there, you can see why. And so you have, while there's, you have the man guilty of having his father's wife, open fornication. Nobody was doing anything about it. That's a problem. Going to law one with another. Division over worldly wisdom. All of those things that you see reflected in the culture was a problem in the church. And yet they're dealt with. And anytime we have similar problems, we've got the record to deal with. You look like you want to say something, Martha.
I'm just listening.
Okay. All right. Let's answer some of our questions. Number one, Paul's departure from Athens was different. We talked about that a while ago. How was it different, and what may have been the reason? How was it different? There was no what? No persecution, right, Janice? And what may have been the reason? Well, yeah, very few Jews, and there was evidently a lot of indifference toward what Paul had to say. Whom did Paul meet in Corinth, and why were they there? Well, it was the couple, Aquila and Priscilla. And why were they there?
Claudius ordered the Jews out of Rome.
They had to leave the.
Right, because Claudius said, Raji, I think you said part of it.
all Jews to depart.
That's right. And this is an interesting thing. We've got history for that, that you can date. Well, that's about AD 49. Now, we don't know exactly how long that they had been there, but not much longer, 52 probably. Whether Aquila and Priscilla were Christians before Paul arrived is difficult to tell. Usually Luke identifies people if they are disciples or not. It would seem they were not, and yet they will be converted quickly. All right, number 3, from other passages. Now, in this question, what I did was I traced throughout the New Testament, and there are not but about, 5 passages where this wonderful couple is mentioned. But we learn so very much about the quality of their lives and their goodness. I put together years ago, it's been a long time ago now, I put together a little study kind of with a few questions, topical study. And I forget what I even called it, but it was more along the lines of growing into a godly husband and wife. And I used it when people wanted me to try to have part in the marriage ceremony. And I'd have just a couple of sessions with them. And I used this as kind of a springboard into talking about a number of other things. What do we learn about them in Acts 18, verse 18? Raj, what do you have for that?
They went with Paul to Ephesus.
Exactly. And then they stayed there in Ephesus. All right, Acts 18, 24 through 26. Karen, what about that?
That's where they took Apollos aside and explained to him the way of God oriented.
Yeah. Now think about this. If you were making a lesson on this couple, you could say, well, according to verses 18 and 19, they weren't afraid of doing what? They left Corinth and went with Paul to Ephesus. They weren't afraid of doing what? Moving. The older I get, the less I used to. I looked at moving as an adventure. But that's when I could get everything in the back of the Volkswagen. But literally, I did that. But you get more, and then you don't have the energy you used to have. But anyway, they moved with him to Ephesus. They went with this gospel preacher. And then in 24 through 26, what lesson could you draw from that? They were willing to do what to Apollos? To teach it. They were teachers. Now this is an interesting little idea about them. He starts off in Acts 18, 1 and 2, that Paul found a man by the name of Aquila. And then his wife is mentioned. But in every other instance, who is mentioned first? Priscilla.
I noticed that too.
What was that?
I said, I observed that also.
Yes, every other time. It's kind of like, you remember in Acts 13, it's Barnabas and Saul, Barnabas and Saul. They get down to Lystra, and then from then on it's Paul and Barnabas, Paul and Barnabas. And it just seems like, now I don't say that to say that she led them, but it could very well be that she, was highly persuasive. In Aquila, don't you think it would be a good idea for us to do that? And yeah, we all know that in seeing various husband-wife teams, that one usually is a little more laid back, the other is a little more aggressive in doing things and going. I seldom see that they're two just alike. My dad used to say, we wouldn't have been living where we lived if it hadn't been for your mama. Because my mom wanted to pick up sticks and move from Fairfield down to Alabaster. Dad was happy where he was, but he didn't mind moving either. And it wasn't, and I think a lot of cases like that, the wife may be, maybe she's just more talkative. Lee and I knew a couple, and I won't mention the city, but it's a different city. And the man was just by nature extremely reserved. And his wife was just, you just couldn't stop her from talking. And she wasn't sinning. It was just her nature to be a little bit. And I think that you have, but this can come up sometimes on the role of women, that she is involved as well as Aquila. Priscilla is involved as well as Aquila in teaching Apollos. But I know that she would not have done it in such a way where she had dominion over or was dominating over their teaching as per 1 Timothy 2. I permit not a woman to teach nor have dominion over a man, but to learn in quietness. And so I know that while she could have maybe instigated something, Apollos, would you like to come over to the house where Aquila and I can talk with you about these matters? I can see that happening. And that's not doing anything out of order, And then both of them work together. Does that make sense? She's not dumb. 1 Timothy 2, I permit not a woman to teach nor have dominion. It's the idea of lecturing over, dominating, basically like a lecture hall. She's not doing that. But can she offer suggestions, read a passage, make suggestions? Yes, all that. And anyway, I think it's just a good point to make about this wonderful couple. Comment, question? I'm doing all the talking here. Raj, you look like you wanted to say something. Anybody? Janet? Karen? Anyone? Janice? Okay. All right. So they were willing to teach. Also, they were willing to take this high-powered orator aside, to take somebody who was extremely versed, and that didn't bother them. Romans 16:3. Where? Who's next? Janet. Where is this couple now?
They're in Rome, and Paul wants to greet them, and they calls them fellow workers. And then on down in the next verse, he says they risked their necks for him.
Yes. Yeah. We don't know how, but whatever they did, they possibly in some kind of a persecutorial role that they maybe hid Paul or did something, but they laid down their necks for his account. Yes. All right. Did you have something else you wanted to add?
On down one more verse in there, and it comes up later, the church met in their house.
Yes, exactly. So, all right, so they're back in Rome. Paul called them his fellow workers. They laid down their necks for Paul's sake, and the church, at least at Rome, met in their house at that point. Wow. Wow. They're not only teaching Apollos, they're willing to leave and go with this preacher to a city and set up shop there. And then when they are back in Rome, something happens. They lay down their necks for Paul, and the church is meeting in their house. You know, so hospitality. I've made the point before in trying to talk with usually young people who are getting married. It's so good to be united spiritually. Well, because you take this couple, you've got to have both parties in agreement if you're going to have a church meeting in your house. You got to have both on the same page, both on board. This is going to, we've got the perhaps they had resources, they had more money perhaps, and we can do this, and we want to do this to help the Lord's cause. So whatever the case was, they did it, and I think that's a tremendous lesson for all of us. Try to be united and with each other spiritually. So they're back in Rome. All right, 1 Corinthians 16:19. Janice, what do you have for that?
Well, they weeded the Corinthians, and they have plugged in their house there.
Exactly. And Paul was back, Paul was writing the Corinthians from Ephesus. So evidently they're back in Ephesus now. So he saluted the Corinthians from Ephesus, and they are with him there. All right, and then 2 Timothy 4. Timothy was likely in Ephesus here. We know he was in the first letter. Likely in the second letter. In Ephesus, Paul wrote to Timothy, and he did what there again? You mentioned it, Janice? Greeted them, yeah, saluted them. So they're back in Ephesus, and so you've got them in Rome. Then they come to Corinth, and then they go with Paul to Ephesus. They stay there. Then they're back in Rome, back in Ephesus when we end them. So you've got those cities.
Paul in prison there?
Yeah, in Rome.
So he was thinking about them as somebody dear to him.
Dear to him, yes. Great point, Janet. That's exactly right. Great point. So with those 5 verses, could you make a sermon? Maybe more than one, could you? But great. That's one of those great couples, kind of like Barnabas. You know, you just, there's so much good about them that you like to talk about. What was their trade? Number 4, tent makers. And I first mentioned Paul's occupation. Jewish boys were taught trades. According to most authorities, this was a lucrative business. If it were, it would explain why the church could have met in their house on all those different occasions, you know. While Paul made tents for a living, where did he spend his Saturdays, and what did he do? Well, he went into the what? Synagogue. He reasoned in the synagogue. 18:4, number 6. The Greeks connected with the synagogue. Compare chapter 13:43. These Greeks were likely what or who? Proselytes, yes, devout proselytes, likely and possibly God-fearers as well. All right, number 7. The following passages relate information concerning Paul's support while in Corinth. State briefly what that information is to the side of the verses listed. All right, 1 Corinthians 9, Paul what? Paul did what? Or did not do what? That's right. Paul did not take support from the Corinthians. He did not want to be a hindrance to some, though he made the point he had a right to do it, but he forewent the right. In 2 Corinthians 11, 7 through 9, he said he robbed other churches doing what? Taking wages of them that he might not burden the church at Corinth. Now do you see that goes back to our point about Silas and Timothy coming from the churches of Macedonia in Acts 18:5. And they bring down support, and Paul alludes to that in these passages here. And then Philippians 4:15 and 16, for the first day of the now, no church has had fellowship with me in the matter of giving and receiving, but you only. For even in Thessalonica you sent once. And Philippi was a church in what region? Macedonia. I don't have the map, do I? Macedonia. And so let's go backwards just a little bit, Brother Charlie. Well, we'll just leave it right here. Here's Macedonia, Philippi, Thessalonica, Berea. Here's Corinth right here. And so that's where they had come where they had come to with the support for Paul. All right, number 8. After Silas and Timothy arrived, Paul was constrained by the word, or as the New American Standard says, began devoting himself completely to the word, testifying to the Jews that Jesus was the Christ. Considering the passages listed in the previous question, how would Paul then be able to devote himself completely to the word after they arrived? By what?
Funds that were brought to him.
That's right, by the funds that were brought to him. After their arrival, this also provided the occasion for Paul's first letter to the Thessalonians. Compare Acts 18:5 with Acts 17:15 and 16, where he said he sent Silas, he told Silas and Timothy to come to him with all speed. And 1 Thessalonians 3, especially verse 6. Before we answer, let's read that. Let's turn over. Just take a moment and read 1 Thessalonians 3. That is almost the whole chapter, but it's easy reading. And we understand a lot more of what's going on in Acts from this. Okay, read with me here. Are you ready? 1 Thessalonians 3, verse 1. Wherefore, when we could no longer forbear, we thought it good to be left behind at Athens alone. Now and sent Timothy, our beloved brother and God's minister in the gospel of Christ, to establish you, to comfort you concerning your faith. Quick question. In Acts, did we find Timothy coming to Paul in Athens? Yes or no? Did he record that Timothy came? No, it's not there. So this is additional information. At some point, Timothy came to Paul in Athens, but Paul did what? Sent him back up to Thessalonica. And that's what he has reference to there in verse 2. I sent Timothy back to you to comfort, that no man be moved by these afflictions. For yourselves know that hereunto we are appointed. For verily, when we were with you, we told you beforehand that we are to suffer affliction, which actually that they were, even as it came to pass, and ye know. For this cause I also, when I could no longer forbear, sent, that I might know your faith. That is, I sent Timothy to you, that I may know how things are going. Lest by any means the tempter had tempted you, and our labor should be in vain. Now, fast forward. But when Timothy came even now unto us from you, and brought us glad tidings of your faith and love, and that ye have good remembrance of us, always longing to see us, even as we also to see you. For this cause, brethren, we were comforted over you in all our distress and affliction through your faith. For now we live, if ye stand fast in the Lord. For what thanksgiving can we render again unto God for you, for all the joy wherewith we joy for your sakes before our God, night and day, praying exceedingly that we may see your face and may perfect that which is lacking in your faith. Now, doesn't that help a lot? That helps us to see, okay? Paul's in Athens, sends Timothy up, because Timothy joins Paul in Athens. He sends him up, he's so concerned. Timothy comes back, has funds from the churches of Macedonia, and a good report about how the Thessalonians are doing. So that elicits this, or solicits, I should say, this response that Paul gives, which is the First Thessalonian letter. And he's happy, thankful that they're doing so well. Does that make sense to everybody? Do you follow how everything's going together? Okay. All right. So the answer then on number 9, down at the bottom of the page, be able to tell what happened to Timothy, Silas, and Paul's feelings for the church at Thessalonica. Okay, so you fill in the blanks. Timothy came to Paul at Athens. Paul was concerned about the church at Thessalonica. So he did what? Sent Timothy back up. All right, Timothy finds what's going on, gathers money together, and then along with possibly Silas over in Berea, they both come down to Paul as per Acts 18 verse 5 and bring money as well as a good report that things are going well in Thessalonica. Does that make sense? Okay, let's answer maybe, let's just answer the bottom of the page and maybe stop. As Paul continued pressing the gospel, a breach developed. Describe what happened. Who has something you want to add, put on that? Anybody? Janet, you look like you're ready.
Paul taught the Jews of Jesus, and they opposed him and blasphemed. So he left them and went to the Gentiles.
Exactly, yes. And moved into this different place. They rather than around the synagogue, they went to the house of Titus Justus. Yeah. Comment, question? All right, it's time to stop. I thought we might get a little farther, but that's okay. We got covered a fair amount of ground. Karen, you look like you wanted to say something.
No, I was just gonna say question 11 kind of goes along with that. If you want to.
Yeah, okay. What is the meaning of Paul's symbolic action mentioned in verse 6 when he shook out his raiment? Basically, he said, I'm what? I'm done with you. I'm having nothing more to do with you. Yeah. Well, let's answer 12 too. What is notable about the conversion? Yeah. What's notable about the conversion of Crispus given the circumstances? All right, Crispus was the ruler. And where did he find difficulties, persecution coming? From the Jews in the synagogue. Yeah. And I mentioned the quote from McGarvey, it was very seldom men of high positions in the synagogue obeyed the gospel. It's therefore greatly to the credit of Crispus that he did so. And this at the moment when the opposition and blasphemy of the other Jews was at its height. He must have been a man of independence and sincerity, the very kind of man to form the nucleus for a congregation of disciples. Okay. Let's stop on that. A little more detailed question on number 13. Okay. Any other comment or question? All right. Well, thank you for your interest, and hopefully we'll have some people back next week. But thoroughly enjoyed our time together. It does me a lot of good, and hope it brings to life these letters, and the circumstances that were behind. Let's have a prayer, and we'll be dismissed. Our Father in God,